let's get to our speakers. Folks, we have a tradition at the awareness summits. We always have the first talk start with the problem, the bad guys. Then the rest of the day focuses on the solution. And today is no exception, and I am so thrilled. I have one of my biggest heroes here to share with us today, Katie Nichols. She is one of the world's leading experts in cyber threat intelligence. She teaches the course on cyber threat intelligence at SANS. Have you ever heard of the MITRE ATT&CK framework? I always like to go, not only do I know the MITRE ATT&CK framework, I know one of the people that wrote and developed the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and that is Katie. So folks, Katie is going to share with her expertise with the bad guys. While she's talking, ask questions at the chat channel, but Katie will be here afterwards in the SANS hallway to answer your questions. Katie, it's all yours. You're on mute.
There's the unmute button, the joys of Zoom. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Lance, for that kind introduction. I need Lance to follow me around and be my hype man, right? Wherever I go, Lance hypes me up. So I'm so happy to be here. You know, of course, wish I could see you all in person, but I'm glad we can be here virtually. I'm in Alexandria, Virginia, and I know at least we have one person from Virginia. I saw some folks in France. I know we have some West Coasters, saw someone from Oregon, so welcome and thank you so much for joining me this morning, regardless of where you are. So thinking about this forum, security awareness, what you all do every day, it's all about humans, right? And we think about securing the human, all the work Lance has done, others, all of you, and we often think about humans being vulnerable and a human victim, but this morning I want to kind of think about how adversaries are also human and why that matters so much, and thinking about the human side of those threats. So let's dive right in. A little bit about me. My day job is as a director of intelligence for a company called Red Canary. If you're not familiar, Red Canary does managed detection response. You might be familiar with the open source atomic red team framework, or you might be familiar with our company's super soft Red Canary shirts. And so my job is super fun. I get to look at data, look at threats all day. I get to try to figure out how can I help other people, our customers, the community, improve their decisions. That's what cyber threat intelligence is really all about. Improving the decisions that you make based on an understanding of what these threats are doing. And my passion is cyber threat intelligence. That's what I've been doing for over a decade. As Lance said, you know, when I'm not the director of intelligence at Red Canary, I also teach the SANS course on cyber threat intel, and that's a lot of fun as well. That's my passion in life. And my Twitter handle, my name is Katie Nichols. My Twitter handle is like the coins. Don't overthink it. I'm not a coin collector. So happy to engage with you all on Twitter. I'm kind of keeping an eye on Slack. If I look over here on the Q&A panel, so if you have questions at any point, feel free to toss those in. And I think as part of our about me is I feel like we should start to introduce like what's keeping us sane and healthy in these times. And two things for me. One is my dumbbells. Luckily, I ordered some dumbbells right before all this happened in March. And so whenever I can, I get out onto my back deck and try to exercise and move every day. Even if they're really, really pathetic dumbbell presses, I do some kind of movement as much as I can. And then I got to balance that out. Chocolate is also keeping me sane. I really enjoy baking. I haven't gotten the bread craze. I'm more of a cookie cupcake kind of girl, but that's how I achieve some balance and some sanity in these times. That's a little bit about me. All right, so I want you to go ahead and imagine a cyber threat. I know it's the beginning of the day and you're like, I don't want to work. Now just think of what a cyber threat is. Like imagine something in your mind. And, you know, maybe I think Cassie had that background of the hacker cat. Maybe it's a hacker cat, but think of what a cyber threat is in your mind. I imagine that at least a few of you thought of code. the bits and bytes, the ones and zeros, malware we focus on so much. I spend a lot of my day elbows deep in logs, looking at network connections, looking at executables, the code. It's so easy to focus on that. And sure, that's a cyber threat. But what I want you to think of, and what we're going to be focusing on today, is what I think the true cyber threat is: the human brain. Because if you think about it, that code we look at, that malware, those executables, making those network connections, someone coded that at some point. We often see interactive command shells where an adversary is maybe running commands on a victim, and there's someone behind that keyboard typing those commands. And so what I want you to think about is the fact that it's really the human brain that is the biggest cyber threat of all. And as we, yes, look at code and executables, and we do malware analysis and forensics, ultimately a human was behind that at one point. And so I think this community does a great job of focusing on the human victims, right? Educating our users, as we should. And I know we have awesome speakers today who will dive into that. But also think about how the adversaries are human too. And as such, that's really the challenge of what we have to protect against. The code is a means to the end, but the human brain is the ultimate cyber threat. And so what I'll be doing this morning is diving into some recent examples of different cyber threats we've seen and thinking about how the human ingenuity and the innovation is what makes these particularly threatening. So a little gloom and doom, as Lance said, kind of the bad news of cyber threats, but don't worry, we'll finish off on a positive note and setting up for the rest of the day. Let's dive right in. For decades and decades, adversaries have exploited social engineering. You all know this better than anyone. Adversaries prey on human feelings, on fear, uncertainty, and doubt. FUD, you often hear that term, FUD. And I don't know about you, but in the last couple months, almost every day I feel a little fearful, uncertain, or doubtful. We joke about it, but it's been a rough couple months, folks. I don't know about you, but it certainly has been for me. And it's fascinating because, adversaries know this. And so while social engineering has been around forever, and we know this, perhaps it's a little different now, because on a global level, we're all so affected by this pandemic. And so our emotions are even more heightened. And again, this is nothing new. Adversaries often will prey on, being curious. There's some new event in the news and they'll send out phishes about that. Click here for exciting news on this. But the more human emotion and the more fear, uncertainty, and doubt we have, I think that it inherently has changed things for our users. And I love this graphic from an awesome woman named Sharon DeGrippo from Proofpoint. I just borrowed it because I couldn't break it down better than this. In the past few months, we've seen a massive increase in phishing themes using the coronavirus for the reasons that I just mentioned. What better way to get someone to click on something than exploiting that fear, uncertainty, and doubt that we all feel? And it's interesting, though, to think about the use of these coronavirus themes because, yeah, that's different. It's a different theme, but some things are the same. Right. And when this whole thing started, my team was looking at what we were observing in our customer environments, and we saw a lot of the same malware. Malware takes a lot of work for adversaries to write new versions. And so we saw a lot of the same malware, but it was coming in using these coronavirus themes in phishes. And so it's important to think about, I think, what's the same and different about our current situation. And yeah, a lot of the malware, the code is the same. But what's new, as I mentioned, is this pervasive sense of FUD. The fact that our employees are stressed. Maybe as someone who's used to being in an office has 3 kids and a dog screaming in the background. And that is very, very different. And as Lance set up this morning, we have a very remote workforce now. So many people working from home. And so that's different as well. And all of these factors, I think, have just made employees even more vulnerable, and perhaps our networks as well, with things like open remote desktop protocol, which could allow adversaries to connect in. And I think the important thing for all of us is to empathize with our users. And I know so many of you are excellent at doing this already. Empathize with our users and realize that it is tough for them. It is tough. They're in new situations, and to maybe be a little kinder to them than we would have been already. So here's an example. Yeah, adversaries absolutely exploiting fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Coronavirus news, click here, open this attachment. This is an example of what I would consider kind of leveling up in terms of human ingenuity. Well, yeah, I could send something about the latest coronavirus stats or news, but what if as an adversary, I sent something that made someone think that they were getting fired? So I've adapted this. This is not a real phishing email, but it's almost real. I've adapted this from an email that Sophos wrote about in a blog post. I've just thrown in my name in there. Subject, you're invited to join the Q2 meeting with HR and payroll. Your presence is crucial. Some kind of, urgency. Very common that we see that in phishing. Join this live meeting purpose, contract suspension, termination trial. I don't know about you, but if I got this email, I might click. I've been doing this for years. I know all about phishing emails, but if I felt like my job was on the line, like that's exploiting human emotion to another level. And it's funny because I showed this slide to my colleague and he was like, I mean, this was a real meeting, right? And I was like, no, I'm not getting fired, right? No, it looks real though. And it's easy to kind of overlook and say, oh, users don't click, but think about how you would feel, how I would feel getting an email like this and fearing for your job in a time when you're already so uncertain about everything. So yeah, phishing themes, coronavirus themes, that's what we've seen a lot of, but there are some that I would say are kind of next level in terms of human ingenuity. Adversaries always thinking about what else could they do to make it a little scarier. The next cyber threat to talk about, you knew it was coming, ransomware. We can't go a day or a week without hearing about a new ransomware attack. My team looks at these all the time, and it's incredibly tragic. You hear about hospitals or schools getting ransomed. Absolutely awful. But if you take a step back and kind of look at ransomware in a neutral academic way, it's a little bit fascinating to think about how we've had malware for a long time, worms have been around, etc. But someone thought, a human thought, well, cool, I could just put code and steal something or, wreck your machine. But what if we held all of your data for ransom? A human had that thought. And after ransomware started, you see this huge adoption taking off because it works. It's so tough if you've been hit by ransomware. Like, my sympathies, because that is a rough day and trying to decide, do I pay the ransom or not? And we'll talk about how that can be even more complicated. But ultimately, ransomware relies on a system of trust. Adversaries do this because it works. And imagine if we all just said, we're not going to pay you. Nope. We all agreed. Everyone in the entire world agreed we're not going to pay the ransom. Adversaries would likely give it up, which is why you might hear some law enforcement advising you don't pay the ransom. But that's tough. All your data is encrypted. If you pay, you'll get it back. It's a tough decision. And so ransomware, I think, is one of the most interesting examples of the human threat. A recent ransomware family and campaign that my team has seen, folks at Symantec put out an awesome blog that I've used to inspire this slide. This family is called WastedLocker, and the group behind this is known as Evil Corp. Yeah, really, if you're an adversary, don't call it Evil Corp. Come on. Yeah, so two Russian adversaries were actually indicted a few months ago for Evil Corp. They've been behind a bunch of different attacks, and the latest one is WastedLocker ransomware. And so you think ransomware, yeah, you come in and you just ransom the files. But the interesting thing about WastedLocker was they kind of had some other steps along the way that are outlined in the slides. So the adversaries would start out and their victims would be redirected from some legit site that they'd compromised. So you get redirected, and then they would deliver malware called sock Golish. Kind of a fun name, sock Golish, and this is malware that my team has seen quite a bit used as kind of an initial access vector. Download a malicious zip file. From there, some PowerShell execution, some code to download another tool called Cobalt Strike, really common red teaming tool that adversaries like as well. And after the adversaries moved laterally, kind of learned about the environment, used Cobalt Strike, then they would drop the WastedLocker ransomware. That'd be the last step. So it's kind of interesting because you often might have heard this idea that, well, adversaries have the advantage. They only have to be right once, but defenders have to be right every time. Well, check this out. You have all of these different steps before your files are actually ransomed to try to catch these actors. And I had a note, yes, Evil Corp, that reference is from Mr. Robot. So kind of anonymous attendee chiming in with that. So think about the fact, and some organizations, I think, caught this early. We have an opportunity to try to catch these adversaries before they get to the ransomware phase. So think of this as an opportunity rather than a challenge. You have all of these chances to identify these adversaries and kick them out before you get ransomed. So this is sort of a classic ransomware example, one that my team has recently been seen a lot around the entire community. I talked about how ransomware is a very human type of malware. And you might have noticed or read about the fact that ransomware operators actually have support. This is a screenshot from a blog from one company, and it's on the malware known as Ragnar or WastedLocker. And I talked about how adversaries have the incentive to, have people pay ransoms and to keep this thing going. Right? If people pay ransoms, the adversaries get money, then they next time, people know if I pay the ransom, my files are going to get decrypted and I can go on. And so adversaries actually have an incentive to help their victims be able to pay the ransom. So you'll often see in ransomware, you get some kind of, note dropped to the desktop, something like that, a note with a ransom demand saying, pay us Bitcoins, go to this link, email us here. And WastedLocker operators actually have a support chat. And so we see here a screenshot of, hello, can I help you? And our victim asking, what do we have to do to get our data back? We want my data, please give it back to me. And they say, all right, you need to pay me in Bitcoins, cryptocurrency. And just to show that, we're for real, we'll decrypt 2 files for free. I always think of that like an infomercial, right? Like 2 files free decryption. So it's fascinating, this human aspect of ransomware, that adversaries actually will support victims because they want their money. If I don't know how to get Bitcoins, they will help me. So that's pretty common, having some kind of support for ransomware operators. But the operators of WastedLocker leveled up a little bit in their human ingenuity. This is absolutely fascinating. The adversaries offered what I would say consulting. After the victim paid the ransom, they gave them security recommendations on how to avoid ransomware in the future. Seriously, it was in Reuters. I'm not making this stuff up, folks. It's kind of amazing. Maybe we've often seen this with adversaries. They don't want other people to compromise their victims. So you should turn off local passwords. You should get an endpoint detection response appliance. Don't count just on antivirus. It's absolutely fascinating, but adversaries gave their victims security recommendations. Another example of how the threat is human, but even maybe adversaries have a heart of gold and they want to help their victims after they've paid. So something to think about, maybe if you pay a ransom, you'll get free security advice, but that's not a good way to go about it. You can get consulting in other ways, of course. That's ransomware, something we've seen quite a bit. And what we've also seen is that some operators are doing more than just ransoming. So you might be familiar with the Maze ransomware, and this just came out, I believe, yesterday, that Maze operators, what they do is they say, you have to pay our ransom. And if you don't pay us a ransom, we're going to leak your files. And so that is so tough. You have to calculate the risk of not just not paying the ransom because you might lose your data, but now that could be leaked. And on the screen is a supposed leak of files from LG. just came out yesterday, and this just throws a wrench into this entire ransomware thing. And again, human ingenuity at work here. The fact that, well, losing my data, that's bad enough. But what's worse than that? Leaking sensitive data. And so these maze operators have changed this up even more and added to this very, very difficult calculus that we already have to make in terms of ransomware. I have an interesting question come in terms of Garmin paying for ransomware. What's the likelihood? You might have heard Garmin was one of the groups impacted, one of the companies impacted by ransomware recently. What's the likelihood that they might get hit again or not by the same group? It's a really tough question. And, in cyber threat intelligence, we have to make assessments. Generally, and this is based on anecdotal experience, I've found that a lot of operators don't go back to compromise the same victim. That said, if I were an adversary, if I were a ransomware operator and I knew Garmin paid a ransom that was public, I might say, excellent, I know that they will pay a ransom, so I should go after them. So I don't think we can know for sure. Anecdotally, I haven't seen much evidence of the same group going after victims again. That's not to say that it might not happen. So good to always be thinking like an adversary. That's ransomware. We can't talk about cyber threats without talking about that. And I suspect that we're going to keep seeing ransomware as long as it works, as long as those adversaries are getting that money. The next attack vector, physical devices. This one's funny. Lance mentioned, I mentioned that I teach for SANS cyber threat intelligence, and we talk about the cyber kill chain, and we talk about the delivery phase. And I have a slide where we talk about the common delivery vectors. Email is a huge one, web is a huge one, and then there's a bullet that says, USB drives, CDs, DVDs, and I used to say, well, yeah, USB drives, that used to be an attack vector, delivery vector, but we're not so worried about that anymore. And, I haven't seen that in a while. And I used to say that to my classes. And then, of course, a couple months ago, I see this tweet from the FBI saying, have you gotten a USB device in the mail? It might be malware. And I was like, all right, well, shame on me. It's so easy for us as cyber threat intel analysts or as security professionals. We should be thinking about trends. And what are the things that we see adversaries commonly do? But don't count out old attack vectors. Thumb drives, many years ago was a massive compromise of government networks in the US. Now details have been declassified on that. And we're so concerned about USB malware. And my team still sees worms being spread by USBs. FBI issued this, this tweet and this alert that if you get USBs in the mail, beware. And some security researchers actually did some additional work, and they suspect that what the FBI was referring to here were thumb drives sent by a group known as Fin7. Named by FireEye, Fin7 is a financially motivated group that's targeted a bunch of organizations, retail, hospitality, and they found that a lot of organizations had received thumb drives in the mail, sometimes with a gift card even. So just think about the fact that, sometimes you might count out certain attack vectors from adversaries. I probably would not educate my users day to day that, hey, beware of getting a thumb drive in the mail. But honestly, if adversaries do this, I'm going to guess that it works at least some of the time. Otherwise, they wouldn't bother. So don't count out old attack vectors like thumb drives. Keep educating your users on thumb drives. It's still around. Fin7 has done this in the past couple months. Our next attack vector, called consent phishing. So this is something that, adversaries always try to get around security controls. If they know, well, if I send an email with a bad attachment, a lot of email gateway appliances will remove that attachment. And so adversaries constantly have to think about, how do we get around all of those defenses? And consent phishing is sort of tricking a user into allowing access. So we'll dive into an example. So this is a seemingly normal email, Excel attached, Excel shared with you. Maybe if your organization uses Microsoft OneDrive, this would be pretty normal. And this is where, it can sometimes get pretty challenging. This is a phish, but can be challenging to identify these because I don't know about you, but whenever I look for possible phishing hints, And I'm sure you've trained users on this. Look for misspellings, right? Look for weird senders. But SharePointOnline.com, I don't see any misspellings here. That this looks pretty legit. So pretty convincing email, and there are actually no attachments to this. There's just a link in the email. And that link goes to MicrosoftOnline.com. Cool, seemingly legit, MicrosoftOnline.com. And this is also where adversaries try to think about what defenders are looking for. I, as a defender, looking at my network logs, scrolling down, I see MicrosoftOnline.com. Cool, no worries, no problem. Adversaries know this. So cool, an email comes in, doesn't really look bad, doesn't have an attachment. A user clicks on this, I see in the logs MicrosoftOnline.com. And then what the user is presented with is this. A request for permission. This is where the consent phishing part comes in. So there's an authentication method known as OAuth, which maybe you haven't heard that term OAuth, but you've probably done this before. You get this little screen where it's actually very convenient. You don't have to create a separate account for certain services, maybe new applications. If you're using a Google or Microsoft account, you just accept and you let this other application get access. Cool, and I don't know about you, but I'm pretty used to just clicking accept. This app would like to maintain access to data, read your contacts, sign you in, read your mail, read and write to your mailbox settings. And I'd say that application developers honestly have made us all a little click happy, because for most applications, you just have to accept this. So cool, I just go ahead and accept. Yeah, it was a Microsoft, Excel attachment, and I would just accept. I want to see the attachment. So this is something that adversaries are doing more and more, this consent phishing with something like OAuth, which is this kind of authorization. And again, it's always thinking about how defenders are catching the adversaries. Email attachments, that's too annoying because email gateway appliances might catch me. But if I use this OAuth thing, I just have to get a user to click on a legitimate Microsoft link and then accept that my malicious application gets permissions to do all of these things. This one can be particularly tough to catch as well. As a defender, these logs might look legitimate. And so we've seen this quite a bit. Microsoft actually took legal action recently. And I showed you, one variant of the phish with an Excel file. Of course, adversaries have used coronavirus themes in that as well. So this is something to watch out for and educate your users on, this idea of consent phishing and OAuth. We're pretty good at not clicking on links maybe or attachments that might be weird, but what about clicking on a Microsoft link? It seems harmless until you allow an application that controlled by the adversaries to have all of these accesses to your different settings. So one to definitely watch out for. The next one, business email compromise, BEC, and hopefully you've heard of this one, but if not, we'll walk through it. This is the idea that adversaries try to steal money in whatever way they can, and they realize that things like crypto mining or ransomware will get you part of the way, but if I just trick a user into sending me money, that might be a lot easier. So business email compromise. This graphic from the FBI talks about the different steps, identifying a target, doing reconnaissance. And this is something that security professionals can also have a say in, help users understand the risks of putting out information out there publicly about your email address, too much information about what you do. And hey, I'm out there publicly as well, but educating our users on the risks of that, because adversaries can use all that information, of course, to identify you as a victim or a target. After the adversaries figure out who they want to victimize, they groom them, right? They send emails, maybe phone calls to different folks from your company. Maybe they try to, make a friendship. And this is something adversaries will often do, because as you start to build up that trust, the victim's more likely to do whatever the adversary says. So building up, grooming phase. Then they actually exchange information. Often the adversary will send an email saying, cool friend, we've built up this relationship over a couple months, and we're going to I need some money. I need you to transfer for whatever reason, do a wire transfer. And so the victim goes out and just transfers the money to the adversary. Again, thinking back to what I said at the beginning, we often think about how the threat is code. But in BEC, it's maybe you'll see emails. Maybe you'll see emails back and forth between the adversary and the victim, but there's no malicious code in there. The real threat is the human adversary asking the human victim to send them money. How bad is BEC? I had a colleague review my slides and he checked my math 3 times. These numbers are from an FBI report from the Internet Crime Center, IC3, from the FBI. In 2019, the losses from ransomware, which we talked about, ransomware incredibly pervasive. We can't go a day without hearing about it. 8.9 million, which that's just what was reported to IC3, quite a bit of money. But compare that to the losses from BEC, from this business email compromise in 2019, that was 1.7 billion with a B. Yes, that's 191 times the losses of ransomware. And there's indications that this is not going to change for 2020. And this is why it's so important for all of you to pull folks like me out of the bits and bytes, out of the code, out of that malware, thinking about the people and the process, right? Because if we overlook the process, we risk losing tons of money through BEC. So I need you all to grab folks like me, shake us and say, this is a huge threat. And the main way that you can protect against BEC is by educating users. So this is something, please, if you haven't read up on BEC, I've linked some things in the slides that'll be posted, or Ronnie T, I Heart Malware, awesome dude, great dude to follow on Twitter. But BEC is something you've got to educate your users on. This happens all the time. You get an email from the CEO with a sense of urgency, I need you to wire me money. So watch out for BEC. I don't think that one's going anywhere anytime soon as well. It's interesting. We often think about things like BEC as being cybercrime activity. And I would challenge, maybe you've heard of the idea of cyber criminals versus advanced persistent threats, APTs. And a lot of folks in cyber threat intel think of APTs as often state-sponsored adversaries, Russia, China, other countries. But that term, advanced persistent threats, I would encourage you to think of that in slightly different ways, right? Anyone who's advanced and persistent might be an APT, including maybe criminally motivated actors. So think about that term APT. This is an example, a Russian group known as Cosmic Links recently got into the BEC game as well. And as they do BEC, they're actually very carefully targeting certain companies and certain users. So I would argue that if you're selectively targeting certain users, that's fairly advanced. And if you keep going after your victims, that's pretty persistent. So think of that idea of an advanced persistent threat might be criminally motivated or espionage. And so this is an example of kind of one of the later emails that you might see in a BEC campaign. Cool, Andy, maybe, we've developed a relationship with Andy. Andy, can you send us some money? Just a cool 1.5 million. Here are the details of where you should wire that money. A lot of folks do this. And this is, again, where empathizing with users, you get something urgent from your CEO who needs money, empathizing and training your users, so important in combating BEC. But even BEC, there's maybe no malicious attachment, but they're emails. You could see some kind of cyber component to it. But what is as an adversary? Maybe I use no code at all. How could I do that to compromise organizations? And of course, recent example here, the Twitter hack happened just a couple weeks ago. Ultimately, Twitter came out and admitted that this happened entirely through voice phishing. The 3 adversaries who you might have seen, they were arrested successfully. One of them was 17 years old, called up Twitter employees, convinced them to give credentials. From there, got internal access to a whole bunch of different accounts. And they posted tweets like this one from a bunch of famous accounts with a Bitcoin address, and a lot of folks sent Bitcoins to this. It was financially successful. They also stole some data from Twitter DMs, and they did all of that by not sending any malware, not touching any code, nothing like that, just by calling someone up and asking them to do something. And I know the awareness summit that's coming up in a few months, Rachel Toback is someone who's excellent at voice phishing. So make sure you tune in a few months for her amazing keynote, which I'm sure is going to be excellent. Talking about voice phishing as an adversary, if I can avoid code that pesky defenders might identify, that's an example of human ingenuity here, bypassing those defenders. So that's the bad news. We got BEC, we got ransomware, got all of these doom and gloom, and human ingenuity is at the core of all of it. The human brain, adversaries constantly adapting to these different defenses that we try to put up. How do we deal with that? That's the bad news. And the good news is that we can deal with it. And the way we deal with it is our own human ingenuity. The genius ideas that all of you have. And it's so important that as we come together as a community to try to deal with these adversary threats that are really all about the human brain and human ingenuity on the adversary side, we use our diversity of thought. And I am so thrilled that the amazing Stephanie is going to be leading a panel on diversity and inclusion later today, because diversity of thought is the only way that we can start to combat adversaries' human ingenuity. Sometimes it's the newest person to an organization who has the most unique ideas. Bring in those people, include them, listen to them. Whether you're from different backgrounds, different races, different genders, went from different schools, different regions of the world, we need all of us to come together, share our ideas to combat these adversaries' human ingenuity. And so I leave on this note, we need you. And this is an awesome slide that I stole from Lance shamelessly. Over the years, the Windows operating system, in response to the adversary's human ingenuity, gotten better and better. We can identify code, but as we've talked about, adversaries have human ingenuity. They can bypass that. But over the years, maybe we haven't done as much, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone, to address the human operating system. And so what I need from all of you as security professionals who care about security awareness, I automatically will think about the code, the bits and the bytes. How do we protect against that? I need you to push me to thinking about the human, especially now in these difficult times, thinking about our users. How do we secure the human? With that, that's all we got. So I'll rely on Lance to say if we can take a few minutes for questions. What do you think?
Yep, let's do a question or two, folks. But Katie, just to confirm, you'll be able to spend time in the Slack channel afterwards, because we have a Slack channel just for you.
I will indeed. I see hallway Katie Nichols on my other screen, so I'll hang out there for at least a half hour or so.
And it's been lighting up. People are loving your talk. So
I see some messages.
Yep. But Jennifer, do we have any one or two questions that we can throw Katie's way?
Yeah, we sure do. Morgan Floyd asks a great question. Katie, what are some of your suggestions on how to address the next level FUD campaigns, aside from keeping your workforce informed of the newest threats and campaigns?
Yeah, great question, Morgan. And this is where I think we have to really level up our responses. The main thing that I would suggest in terms of especially coronavirus is for companies to make sure their employees know of how they can get legitimate information. What does legit information about our coronavirus policies or any changes in the workforce, where should that come from? Because then rather than trying to, every campaign that comes up, this email's bad, look for this image or whatever, you can say, nope, just focus on, we're gonna have a weekly meeting, we're gonna have an email coming from this person, you can go to this website. And so I think that proactively directing people to certain resources that provide them information, and honestly being open and transparent about what's happening in a company can go a long way to helping people maybe feel a little less fearful.
Great. One more question here for you. Laurel asks, I don't understand why Garmin would have paid. Surely they have all their important data backed up. And I've seen other variations on this question of people wondering why ransomware continues to work.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Well, just put yourself in you know, a CEO's shoes. Imagine you're sitting there, maybe you're a hospital, and all of your data has been encrypted, and the adversaries tell you, if you just pay $50,000 to us right now, it'll all go away. There's no way that you can get that data back. And yep, they make a great point that ideally you want to have backups, but for some organizations, that's not realistic. You know, think of a hospital trying to back up all of that data. You might not have the resources to do that, or a small school, something like that. And as we talked about, maze operators, they're not just ransoming data, they're leaking it. And so adding that into the calculus, you know, I don't blame any company who pays the ransom, because if you're scared about not just losing your data, but that being leaked to the world, that's why a lot of companies pay. It's not an easy decision.
All right, I'll give you one more before we let everybody go stretch their legs. Narendra asks, do you think having digital signatures for emails will reduce business email compromise?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, setting up PKI infrastructure where it's a digitally signed email. So when I send Lance an email, it's signed. He knows cryptographically that, yep, this comes from Katie with her certificate. That can certainly help out with BEC, combating BEC and other types of phishing. So that'd be a great thing to do. But the challenge is that especially for smaller organizations, that's tough to set up. You know, if you've ever used certificates, it's really frustrating when you try to read an email and you can't get it. So I think that could be a great way to try to reduce the efficiency of BEC, or maybe you just make a policy that for anything involving financial transactions, we have to have a signed email with a certificate. So great point there, great idea.